Welcome to the Morris Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Morris, and I am so glad that you're here. I bring more to this space than just a microphone. I bring my story. I bring the perspective of a retired police officer who stood inside the justice system and seen how decisions are made, how people are labeled, and how perception can follow a person before the facts are fully heard. I bring the perspective of a criminal justice instructor and trainer who has helped students and professionals look beyond textbook definitions and think about justice, accountability, bias, power, and the real people behind the policies. I bring the perspective of an author, a researcher who studies race, language, systems, and the narratives that shape how people are seen, treated, judged, and remembered. These are not just topics for me. I have worked on them. I have taught them. I have lived them. I have studied them. And most important, I have written about them. And I see how one word, one label, one assumption, one system, one mistruth, one lie can change the person story before it's told. That is why I create the Morris Perspective Podcast. This is a space where we do not just accept the story as is. We look again. We listen closer. We challenge what needs to be challenged. And we search for the truth that has been hidden, ignored, or twisted. So settle in, listen, and take a deeper look at the stories, the systems, and the truth that have been hidden through the lens of your host, Connie Morris, on the Morris Perspective Podcast. Hello, welcome back to the Morris Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Morris, and I am loving this series. I didn't know I would, but it's so rich in information and education. We are on our 5th episode, and the title is Who is White Enough? The Myth of Racial Purity. We're going to continue on that same thread, and like we do on the Morris Perspective, is where we discuss the obvious question of what has been normalized and examine the history behind what we see today. And our overall theme is really talking about white spaces. We cover those in the last 2 episodes, and we start talking about how white spaces were created, how it's enforced, how it is enforced, and how Black people were kept out of restaurants, schools, neighborhoods, towns, and entire communities. We also talk about the sundown town and how those are making a big comeback. We talked about Black Wall Street in Greenwood. We took a visit to the Ozarks to find out that we have a white space generation. They want a European ancestry, racial preservation, and they want to decide who belongs in this community. And so my question today is really about that community, that European racial preservation community. And I asked you the question is, who is white enough? And that was a question that came to mind because I think this question will expose the entire problem. Because if you're going to build a community around whiteness, somebody has to define it. Okay. Somebody has to stand at the gate. Somebody has to decide who qualifies, who don't, what ancestry is accepted. Yours isn't. Your husband is acceptable. Yours isn't. Your children qualify, but you don't. And the moment you begin doing that, we are no longer simply talking about land. We're talking about the blood. Whiteness has never been a stable biological category. And that's found in genome.com. This is where science immediately creates a problem for an idea of racial purity. The National Human Genome Research Institute, you can find that at their website, describes race as a social and political construct, not a neat biological division of humanity. It also notes that there is more genetic variation within the self-identified racial group than between them. So like I said before, we're more the same than we are different. Why would that be a problem? I want to read this again. There's more variation within racial groups than between them. So when someone says we have to preserve the white race My question remains, which white race? Because white is not a genetically pure population. European populations themselves have long histories of migration, conquest, intermarriage, movement, and mixing. Humans human beings don't do human beings did not develop inside a sealed racial container. We move, we migrate, we encounter each other, we have children together. This is human history. So the idea of someone untouched white bloodline that must now be protected is already standing on shaky ground. People love each other, they meet and they mingle, and they don't ask the question, are you a pure white? Think about that. So America had to decide who was white. And I taught us a class on race and ethnicity, and we find out that people who migrated to America was always either they were Italians, they had different titles, but they had the white skin. But yet when they came to America, they acclimated to white. And then they went against the people of brown and black skin. So let's continue. And this is what makes America racial history so revealing, because someone has to decide who is white. Whiteness had to be defined. It had to be classified. People had to decide where the boundary was, which boundaries changed. Immigrant groups entered America and discovered that being European did not always automatically mean you were treated white, equally white. Interesting. So you got the same people putting up the gate about who is European pure would not pass the other gate of being actually white. Ethnicity, nationality, religion, language, appearance, and class, all of those influence how groups were received. And over generations, some groups were treated as outsiders, became absorbed into a broader social category of whiteness. That alone should tell us something. If whiteness was simply an obvious biological fact, why did society have to keep negotiating who belongs in that group? Question, if you're on my podcast for learning, you will learn something like if that's such a biological fact, because biological fact is you're black and you're brown. That's a biological fact. White is not a biological fact because it's intermingled with other races, but they don't know it, or they want to ignore it, or they want to put a quote behind it and say, we are pure. Let's continue. When America made whiteness fragile, now here comes one of the most biggest contradiction. Historically, blackness could be treated as expansive. Whiteness could be treated as fragile. One black ancestor could determine your racial classification under certain American racial system, but whiteness demanded distance from black ancestry. Think about that logic. One drop of black ancestry could supposedly make someone black, but one drop of black ancestry could also supposedly make somebody not white. So which race was supposedly stronger? Think about that. The one that absorbed everybody, or the one that could supposedly be destroyed by one ancestor? Now, that's not biology. That was a racial system designed to protect the boundaries of whiteness. And once those boundaries mattered legally, government had to decide where to draw them. So think about this. You have a white community, it's purely white, but yet because they acclimated to white, they might have some black ancestry. And so that baby that comes out between that union may not be all white. And guess what? Because you're not all white. You're a mixture of many different things, not bad things, just race is mingling, right? But think about it. Which one is stronger? Somebody who has one drop of blood makes you all black, or one black drop of blood make you not white? Same thing. Let's continue. So when we talk about this, when two people love each other, they want to be married and they want to reproduce after themselves. So that is why when we think about marriage, how it became a threat, that's why interracial marriage became such an obsession. They had a federal law. I told you we have people in our federal government who have a lifetime appointment who created a lot of this mess. Because if the real concern is preserving a racial boundary, then eventually love becomes dangerous. Marriage becomes dangerous. Children become dangerous. A black husband becomes dangerous. A white wife becomes dangerous. A biracial child becomes evidence that the boundary failed. In the Library of Congress blogs, it mentions America had laws against interracial marriages going back to the colonial period. Library of Congress documents the anti-miscegenation laws existed in British North America and later throughout portions of the United States. I want to pause here because this is interesting. So when we go back to our history and we talk about slaves and we talk about what the white peer owners did to black slaves, they produced a black child, even though they dropped in some white, made a white donation. That baby comes out more chocolate than it comes out white. Why? Because that gene of that black gene is very strong. But yet, the same people who sit on the Congress or sit in the White House or sit in the Supreme Court, they're telling you that one drop of black blood makes you black. But yet behind the doors, you're sleeping with your slaves, producing black babies. I just wanted to go there. I want you to think how contradicting this is for you to have a law at a time when you were sleeping with your black slave. Let's continue. Virginia was still enforcing such a law in the 20th century. Richard Loving was white. Mildred Loving was not classified as white under Virginia law. They married in Washington, D.C., returned to Virginia, and were prosecuted. They were sent to prison with a sentence suspended on the condition that they leave Virginia. Think about that. Two adults marry each other, and one state essentially said, you can't be married, just don't live here together. This is racial territory entering the bedroom. In Rediscovering Black History in 1967, it told us that the United States Supreme Court finally struck down bans on interracial marriage in Loving versus Virginia 1967. This is not ancient history. 67 is not that far off. Think about that. Why you think that happened? Because it didn't make any logical sense. Your racism was now entering to the bedroom, and then now you're convicted because you're sleeping with your slaves. Let's continue. So why was interracial marriage so dangerous to the system? Because interracial marriage breaks the illusion. If white people and black people could marry, if they could have healthy children, if those children grow up, they marry, have children, and life continues, then what exactly is being protected? The racial purity argument requires that the belief that mixing produces decline. This is where pseudoscience enters. People need an explanation for why these racial boundaries supposedly matter. So racism put on a lab coat. Eugenics gave prejudice a scientific vocabulary. Eugenics claimed humanity could be improved through selective reproduction. From the Genome Institute says this. They call it eugenics a scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of racial movement and planned breeding. Eugenicism promotes segregation, exclusion, and involuntary sterilization against people they label unfit. So here we go again. You have people who think they want to play God and say, because you are genetically unfit, you cannot reproduce. Understand the language. Fit, unfit, better stock, inferior stock, good heredity, bad hereditary, better breeding. That is livestock language applied to human beings. And where do we get that from? From the slavery. They used to reproduce the slaves. Slavery was outdated, so they had to reproduce them within the home. And so the black female will continue to have babies that grow up to be slaves. Think about that. So who gets that power? Doctors, scientists, governments, judges, politicians. This is where the danger begins. When we start trying to reproduce or try to tell someone that they are unfit. Let's continue. This was fringe thinking. This is another part people like to clean up. Eugenics was not simply a handful of strange people standing on a street corner. Scientists promoted it. Universities studied it. Doctors participated in it. Governments passed laws influenced by it. Courts gave those laws legitimacy. And the same NHGRI that now rejects scientific racism acknowledged that the leading scientists and respected institution historically participated in these ideas. So we have a major place that said it was okay, that was wrong, but they still participated in it. That should teach us something. Credentials do not automatically make prejudice true. A lie does not become science because somebody placed statistics behind it. Racism does not become legitimate because somebody with it has a degree in it. Then America started controlling reproduction. Think about it. You're trying to have a pure society, not knowing that from the beginning it's already mixed. So we start talking about eugenics did not remain a classroom theory. American American states adopted compulsory sterilization laws. People deemed mentally, physically, socially, or genetically unfit could be sterilized. Governments entered one of those most personal decisions a human being can make, whether they could have children. And this is why I keep telling you that racial purity does not stay theoretical. Once you decide some people are undesirable, eventually somebody will ask, how do we stop them from reproducing? And this is where the belief becomes policy. Who decides that? Now let's talk about putting marriage beside sterilization. Look at this pattern. One law says you cannot reproduce with that person. Another law says you should not produce at all. Think about it. Do you see where both laws assume the government has become legitimate interest in controlling the kind of people who will exist in the next generation? That is the logic of racial and biological engineering. And once you grant somebody that authority, human beings become categories instead of people. Germany took the logic further. The Nazi Germany took eugenics and so-called racial hygiene into a far more radical, murderous direction. Out of the Holocaust Encyclopedia, it says the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum documents how Nazi racial policies included forced sterilization and later laws criminalizing marriage and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. Think about where we started. Who can live here? Then who can marry whom? Then who should produce? Then what population represents a threat? Then how do we remove that threat? The progression is why we cannot treat racial purity ideology like harmless racial pride. History has already shown where the logic can go when government gains the power to enforce it. So welcome back to the Aldors. Remember, we're saying that what they're doing, it seems very innocent on the surface. And I just covered almost 4 episodes on why it's not something we should ignore. Now, everybody take everything we learn about the return to that community, the European ancestry, the white towns, the white nations, the application determining who qualifies, the woman alleging that her Jewish ancestry matters, a black husband, biracial children. Now the question becomes much more serious. What exactly is being preserved? I heard this and I just said, oh my gosh, this is a great topic. Let's continue. Culture, is that being preserved? Then why does her husband race matter? Tradition? Why does ancestry matter? Shared value? Then why does genealogy matter? If someone believes exactly what you believe, lives exactly as you live, worship as you worship, raise their children exactly as you, but their spouse is black, why does that change whether they belong? That question goes directly into the heart of racial purity. Who becomes the gatekeeper? Because racial purity always creates a gatekeeper. Somebody has to inspect the boundary. Someone has to determine how white are you? Where were your grandparents born? What religion were they? Who did they marry? What race is your spouse? What would your children look like? How far back does this ancestry investigation go? 1 generation, 3, 5, 10? And what happens when DNA tested reveals that something you should not expect? Do you lose your membership? Does your child? Does your grandchildren? That is the absurdity of trying to build human belonging around racial purity. Eventually, everybody becomes a genealogy investigation. Science does not rescue the argument. And here's where the modern genetics matter. In the genome.gov website, it says genomic science does not divide humanity into clean, biological, separate racial boxes. They explicitly warn that treating human population as biological distinct groups has helped fuel eugenic and scientific racism. Ancestry is real, geography is real, populations have genetic history, but ancestry and American racial categories are not the same thing. You can't you can study genetic ancestry without pretending humanity consists of biological pure races. So if your argument requires genetically pure populations, science is not going to save you. This is for the Ozarks. Scripture does not save you either because science is telling us something Scripture told us long ago. One blood. God made all nations of people from one blood to dwell upon the earth. Different nations, different cultures, different histories, different languages, different appearances, but not different levels of humanity. So somebody claiming racial purity has a problem on both sides. Biology does not support the pure race mythology, and scripture does not support racial superiority. So what are we protecting? Maybe it's not race. They fear losing. Maybe it's not. And now we get to the deeper issue. Maybe this is not actually about losing white people. White people are not going to disappear because somebody marries a black person. A culture does not automatically disappear because another culture moves next door. A person does not lose rights because somebody else receives equal rights. Maybe what some people are actually afraid of losing is not whiteness. Maybe they are afraid of losing dominance because the majority being the default, being the person everybody else had to adjust around, being able to assume the neighborhood will look like them, the schools will like them, look like them, governments will look like them. Come on now. The people on television will look like them. The person marrying their child will look like them. And when equality changes those expectations, equality can feel like loss of someone who was accustomed to being center. But losing dominance is not the same thing as losing rights. And somebody else enters the room does not mean you're thrown out of it. That is a lie. That is a lie I think people, generations have been sold. They have increased, you decrease. If they gain, you lose. If they move into the neighborhood, it's no longer your neighborhood. If your child marries one of them, your bloodline disappears. If the country becomes more diverse, you no longer have a country. No, you have to believe that humanity is a zero-sum game for any of that to make sense. And God did not say one blood until somebody marries outside their race. He just simply said one blood. Maybe that should be a sign on in your neighborhood. So we cover this, but who is white enough when we think about this? After all this history, we we come right back to the original question. Who is white enough? The person who looks white but has Jewish ancestry, the man whose DNA test reveals African ancestors, the child with one white parent and one black parent, the Italian, the Irish, the Eastern European, the person whose family has been here for 10 generations, who gets a certificate? Who signs it? That is a problem. Once you create a racial purity test, somebody will eventually fail it because purity itself is a myth. So what are we actually been studying? Over the last 3 episodes, we're on our fourth one here. We thought we were studying white space, but we were actually being studying something deeper, belonging. Who gets to decide who belongs? The restaurant owner, the bank, the police officer, the town, the government, the scientist, the eugenicist, the neighborhood association, the private the private membership organization, or does a person who believes their racial identity gives them a greater claim to the land than somebody else? That question has followed us this entire series, and history keeps giving us the same warning. The moment human beings began ranking who belongs based on supposedly superior blood, somebody eventually ends up outside the gate. The space was never pure. So I want to end this series where we began, the creation of white space. White space was never naturally white. It had to be created, sometimes through law, sometimes through money, sometimes through housing, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through violence, sometimes through pseudoscience. And how we have a modern movement trying to create it through ancestry and a private association. But underneath every version sits the same question. Who do you believe does not belong beside you? And perhaps the greatest lie in all of this is the idea that separating ourselves somehow makes us pure. America was never racially pure. European was never racially pure. Humanity was never racially pure. History is migration. History is encounter. History is movement. History is people meeting people. And scripture already gave us the answer on blood. I'm not going to spend my time trying to determine who is white enough. I have a different question. Wow. When are we going to finally be human enough to determine who deserves a place beside it? I'm your host, Connie Morris, and this has been the Morris Perspective Podcast. Our next series is going to talk about something so serious. Whiteness cannot build a white heaven. There is no white heaven. And so if you decided you want to go to heaven, or maybe not, you're going to be surprised when you get there that even though you have it all together, whiteness cannot build a white heaven. I'm your host, Connie Morris, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to the Morris Perspective Podcast with your host, Connie Morris. And if this episode made you think, made you pause, made you check the narratives that you have been believing, or maybe even look at an issue differently, don't stop here. There are more conversations waiting for you, episodes you may have missed, topics you may want to revisit, and discussions that continue to build on what we have talked about today. You can find them on my pod page. A pod page is simply the online home for my podcast. It's where you find all the episodes in one place. You can listen again, you can explore different topics, and you can share episodes with others. And most importantly, you can sign up for my newsletters. To get there, just click on the pod page link listed in this episode description. And yes, it is free. If you have any questions, episode ideas, or simply want to connect with me directly, email me at the Morris Perspective Podcast at gmail.com. Until then, stay empowered, stay in the know, and stay knowledgeable. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.